Hi everyone, my name is Mark Morales and I'm with Alfred Competente, Gerald Flores, Justin Neri, Joanne Ognita, and Arcel Orfiano, and together we are Group 6. Today, we will present to you our arguments on why expectations theory does not explain the term structure of interest rates in the Philippines. Before we present our arguments, what exactly is expectations theory? Expectations theory attempts to predict future short-term interest rates based on the current long-term interest rates. The underlying assumptions of this theory is that maturity is not a consideration in making investments, there are no taxes or transaction costs, investors are rational and the rational expectations hypothesis holds true, and that a premium, if any, is constant over time. To illustrate the expectations theory, let's say that there are two bonds. A 2-year bond that pays an interest rate of 20% and a 1-year bond that pays an interest rate of 18%. Further, let's say investor A invests in the 2-year bond while investor B invests in the 1-year bond. In its purest form, expectations theory assumes that since both investor A and B are rational beings, investing in either bond should eventually achieve equal returns. The return of the investor of the 2-year bond at the end of year 2 will equal to 44%. On the other hand, the return of the investor of the 1-year bond at the end of year 1 will equal 18%. For the investor of the 1-year bond to achieve a return equal to the investor of the 2-year bond, the interest rate of a 1-year bond 1 year from now should then be equal 22%. This is true for the different maturities along the yield curve. Expectations theory also introduced several extensions to better explain why current long-term interest rates cannot exactly predict future short-term interest rates. For simplicity, let's assume the future 1-year interest rates don't change. This will result in an expected theory yield curve that is flat. The expectations theory was extended to consider that there is an additional systematic premium on top of this expectation theory yield curve. This premium can either come from a liquidity premium or an additional risk premium to convince investors to shift from one holding period to another. We will now be presenting our arguments for the against side based on the problem statement. Is the expectations theory reliable in explaining the term structure of interest rates in the Philippines?
The pure expectations theory is anchored on behavioral and institutional assumptions that do not really hold water. The first assumption is maturity is not a consideration in making investments. It assumes that the bond traders do not view long term bonds to be riskier, hence making the securities of all maturities identical and riskless. For example, a lender has the option to invest for 5 years in one of the following: a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year bond. According to pure expectations theory, there is no difference if any of the bond is selected, since the expected return from any of them is the same over the same investment horizon. In the study of Hicks in 1939, he asserted a constitutional weakness in the market for loans, which stems from the existence of liquidity preferences among lenders. He stated that any person entering into a long-term contract is placing himself in a risky position, and in order to encourage that person to do so, the borrower must pay a premium, denoted by letter P in the formula. The second assumption is there are no taxes, information cost, transaction cost, or penalties associated in the exchange of securities. It assumes that the cost to shift from one maturity to another is zero, implying an unrestricted arbitrage. In the Philippine setting, the bondholders are taxed 20% on interest income. In addition to that, they also have to pay for maintenance fee, mapping fee, PDEX transaction fee, broker's commission, and other fees. In reality, these costs are inevitable and must be considered in making investment decisions.
Rational expectation, although optimal prediction, may not be accurate. Even though a rational expectation equals the optimal forecast using all available information, a prediction based on it may not always be perfectly accurate. Reasons why an expectation may fail to be rational. Number 1. People might be aware of all available information but find it takes too much effort to make their expectation the best guess possible. Number 2. People might be unaware of some available relevant information, so their best guess of the future will not be accurate. Number 3. Information necessary to form expectation is not always available, and when it is, it may be very costly to use it. Expectations theory with the assumption of a constant term premium. In general, the forward rate can be viewed as the sum of the market's expectation of the future short rate plus a potential risk premium. According to the expectation theory of the term structure of interest rates, the liquidity premium is zero, so that the forward rate is equal to the market expectation of the future short rate. Therefore, the market's expectation of the future short rates can be derived from the yield curve, and there is no risk premium for longer maturities. However, the limitation of the theory is that many factors impact short-term and long-term bond yields. For an instance, the Federal Reserve adjusts interest rates up or down, which impacts bond yields, including short-term bonds. However, long-term yields might be less affected because many other factors impact long-term yields, including inflation and economic growth expectation.
Another matter the expectations theories fail to consider is the interest rate risk, or the risk due to the uncertainty in future interest rates. In 2017, a research team from the De La Salle University conducted a study with the goal of forecasting the term structure of the Philippine interest rates. Using a set of PDSTR2 data, which was the benchmark interest rate during the time, the team found out that the accuracy of the forecast weakens as the length of the forecast period increases. What this study highlights is the fact that there is a great deal of uncertainty in determining future interest rates in the Philippines. Now, imagine two different investors with similar preferred investment horizons. Assume that their investment horizon is up to time 1. Person A invested in a security that matches his or her investment horizon. Since that is the case, Person A's returns are guaranteed or certain. Meanwhile, Person B invested in a security with a longer maturity than his or her investment horizon. This means that the investor's goal is to liquidate the security ahead of its maturity. However, Person B's returns are not certain. The returns are dependent on the bond price at time 1, which is then dependent on future interest rates. Expectations theories claim that the guaranteed or certain return of Person A will be equal to the expected return of Person B. And since we have established that there is uncertainty in forecasting future interest rates in the Philippines, we can use the proof developed by Cox, Ingersoll, and Ross in 1981 to show that that is not the case. This research team used the Jensen's inequality for concave functions to prove that in a market with uncertainty, guaranteed or certain returns of Person A is always higher than the expected returns of Person B. By the same token, expectations theories also do not consider reinvestment risk, or the risk due to the uncertainty in interest rate earned from rolling over an investment. Using again Person A and Person B as our illustrative example, assume that both investors still have the same investment horizons. However, this time, for a much longer term, say time 2. Person A still invested in a security that mimics his or her investment horizon to guarantee the returns. On the other hand, Person B invested in a security with a shorter maturity. In order to meet his or her investment horizon of time 2, Person B will roll over the investment using the payout at time 1. He or she assumes that the forward rates available at time 0 will be equal to the future spot rates. With this, expectations theories claim that certain return of Person A will be equal to the expected return of Person B. However, many finance economists found evidence that forward rates are not good predictors of future spot rates. This proves that uncertainty is present in the determination of reinvestment rate. This uncertainty is a vital assumption in the study conducted by Cox, Ingersoll, and Ross in 1981. There, they proved again that Person A's certain or guaranteed returns will always be higher than the expected returns of Person B, which is a solid empirical evidence against the three expectations theories.
Expectations theory is conditional on the fulfillment of the fundamental macroeconomic factors. Researchers Ang and Pizzetti find that inflation explains a significant portion of the movements of the yield curve in the short and medium term. In the Philippine setting, BSP currently adopts the inflation targeting as its framework for monetary policy. As shown in the figure, the yield curves as of August 2018 and August 2020 with inflation rates of 6.4 and 2.4 shows that the recent easing actions of the BSP constituted to the drop of yield curves majority on the short term. Studies also show that monetary policies affect the slope and the level of the yield curve. This is evidenced by the positive relationship of the yield curve with BSP's overnight lending rate or OL rate as shown in the figure. The OL rate provides the banks temporary liquidity that affects their short-term investment decisions. Since banks are major players in the government treasury market, this would have a direct impact on the yield curve. Researchers also asserted that real activity would reflect the changing demand for loanable funds in the economy and therefore has an upward impact on the yield curve. In the Philippines, real activity can be measured by unemployment rate, value of production index, and the effect of non-performing loans of commercial banks on the demand for government treasuries. Furthermore, the fiscal policy of the government as reflected in the budget deficit is expected to put upward pressure on the interest rates for both short and long run as the government raises funds to finance its obligations by selling government securities in the market. Philippines is a small open economy and long-term interest rates are subject to external factors. The peso depreciation will drive up the slope or short-term interest rates due to the activeness of the foreign exchange market where any change diffuses immediately to the bond market. On the other hand, although the BSP sets independent monetary policies, international policies, however, induces BSP to respond in the same direction.
Given all these shortcomings of the expectations theory, we present a more complete and elegant solution that can explain interest rates, the market segmentation theory. The main thesis of this theory is that short-term and long-term interest rates should be viewed separately as two different markets. This is born from the fact that short-term and long-term investors have substantially different reasons for playing in their respective markets. Banks, for example, may invest in the short term to keep excess cash from being idle, while pension funds may invest in the long term to match their long term obligations. Under market segmentation theory, the short term bond market is completely independent from the long term bond market. What then determines the yield of a bond? The yield for each segment of the market is affected by each market supply and demand for bonds. Demand being determined by the Treasury bonds interest rate, the interest rate for corporate bonds, the credit risk for corporate bonds, the expected inflation, and the liquidity of the Treasury bond. On the supply side, bond prices depend on the actions of government, which then depend on the state of the economy. A combination of all these interactions between supply and demand in different maturities plotted on a graph gives us the yield curve, as seen in the Y curve on the left. Shifts in the supply and demand curves for Treasury securities change the shape, level, and curvature of the yield curve. In the case of a recession, when corporations issue less short-term and long-term bonds, the yield for Treasury bonds, both in the short term and the long term, will tend to decrease due to the increase in the quantity of Treasury bonds demanded across all maturities. Government action can also shift the supply curve and thereby change the shape of the yield curve. Take the example of a government that is increasing its expenditures. If the government sells short-term Treasury bills, the short-term Treasury bond supply curve shifts to the right, bringing bond prices down and short-term yields up, as seen in the Y prime curve. On the other hand, if the government wants infrastructure, it sells long-term Treasury bonds, shifting the long-term Treasury bond supply curve to the right, bringing bond prices down and long-term yields up, as seen in the Y double prime curve. As such, we believe that the market segmentation theory gives a more complete framework for explaining interest rates, which can be the foundation of all the other theories mentioned earlier. The pure expectations then adds the effect of market expectations of future interest rates. Preferred habitat allows the possibility of transferring from one market to the other if they are compensated enough for the additional risk, and liquidity premium introduces investors' desire to be compensated for locking in their investments for longer periods. Under this framework, expectations of future interest rates is only one among many other factors instead of being the main factor in determining the shape of the yield curve. Therefore, given the inherent flaws of the theory and the empirical data in the Philippine setting which shows this, we reiterate that the market expectations theory in its various forms is not reliable in explaining interest rates in the Philippines. We open now the floor for your questions. Thank you.